The day I gave birth was supposed to be the happiest moment of my life. Instead, it became the day my world shattered. When my son was born, my husband looked at him once and walked away forever. He didn't believe me when I said the child was his. But the truth was even bigger than betrayal. It was buried in my blood, in secrets I never knew. The day of birth, the day Jason was born, should have been the happiest of my life. I'd dreamed so many times of holding my baby in my arms, of seeing Maikon smile proudly, of forming the family I'd always wanted. But reality was very different. When the doctor placed that little being in my arms, I felt immediate love, a love that seemed capable of healing any pain. Yet, at the same time, I noticed my husband's shocked look. Maikon fixed his eyes on our son, but there was no tenderness there. Only disbelief and anger. Jason had dark skin, a tone that didn't suit him or me, two whites with light eyes. The room, previously lit by the baby's cries, fell silent. The heavy silence cut through the air. Until he finally whispered, "That can't be my son." My heart stopped for a second. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After hours of pain, after months of waiting, this was the first reaction from the man I swore to love forever? I shivered, clutched Jason to my chest, and replied weakly, "Maikon, he's your son. I never betrayed you." But my words had no effect. He laughed, a bitter laugh, full of contempt. "Do you think I'm stupid, Claire? You expect me to believe this boy is mine? Look at him." I looked, and saw a perfect baby, with the most beautiful skin I'd ever seen. I couldn't understand how something so pure could become a source of hatred. The nurse tried to intervene, urging calm, but Maikon was beside himself. He turned to my parents, who were waiting outside, and shouted, "This woman deceived me. This child isn't mine." Those words echoed down the hallway, like a punch punching through walls. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run after him, but all my strength was in the baby in my arms. Within minutes, the news spread. I saw the nurses' expressions change. I heard whispers and finger-pointing. I, still lying vulnerable, felt like a criminal exposed before an invisible tribunal. All I wanted was peace to hold my son, but the storm had already begun. When Maikon returned to the room, there was no love in his face. He had already made his decision. He grabbed his ring, tossed it on the small table beside the bed, and said, "It's over. You and this child you invented will live alone. I never want to look at you again." I tried to get up, begging through tears, "Please, Maikon, believe me." I didn't do anything. He didn't answer. He just left, slamming the door so hard that Jason cried out loud in my arms. I rocked him desperately, trying to calm him, but it was myself I wanted to comfort. My life had just changed forever, and I didn't know how to move forward. My parents walked in soon after, their expressions shocked. My mother tried to hug me, while my father looked away, unable to face the baby. Shame hung heavy in the air. But inside I was only confused. I repeated, almost like a prayer, "He's Maikon's. Jason is his son." I didn't cheat. That night, alone in the hospital room, with Jason sleeping against my chest, I felt like the whole world had turned its back on us. But as I looked into that serene little face, I silently vowed, even if everyone abandoned me, I would never abandon my son. The abandonment, when I was discharged from the hospital, there was no one waiting for me at the door. Once, I imagined leaving hand in hand with Maikon, taking our son home in a moment of celebration. But in reality, I left alone, with Jason in my arms and a heavy suitcase pulled by an indifferent staff member. I felt like exile. On the way out, I ran into Maikon's family. They were there, not to support me, but to humiliate me. His mother, with a cold stare, said loudly, so everyone in the lobby could hear, "What shame you brought to our name, Claire. What you did is unforgivable." I tried to respond, but my voice cracked. I held Jason tighter, as if my son were my shield. But they didn't stop. One of the sisters-in-law murmured, "I always thought she wasn't worthy of our family. Now it's proven." The words cut deeper than any knife. I wanted to disappear, vanish, but I couldn't. Jason needed me. I left the hospital with my head held high, even with tears burning my eyes. I hailed a taxi and asked to go to my parents' house. On the way, Jason cried softly, and I couldn't tell if it was hunger, the cold, or if he was already somehow feeling the weight of the abandonment we'd suffered. Arriving home, my mother welcomed me with open arms, but my father remained distant. He said nothing, but his silence was a judgment. I knew that, deep down, he believed in my con. Every time he looked away from Jason, a part of me died inside. That first night home, I cried silently as I rocked my baby. I prayed for strength, because I had no idea how I would raise Jason alone. The future seemed like a dark tunnel with no way out, but when Jason looked at me with those big, innocent eyes, I felt a spark of hope. The next day, Micon sent a cold letter, delivered by a lawyer. Inside were just 2 sentences: "Don't look for me. I don't recognize this child as mine. We're officially finished." Together, the divorce proceedings were ready. I signed with trembling hands, like someone signing their own court order. From that moment on, I was marked. Walking the streets, I felt the eyes piercing my skin. Some with pity, others with contempt. I was the woman who cheated on her husband and had a child out of wedlock. Gossip ran rampant, and no one wanted to hear the truth. But as painful as it was, I had one unshakable certainty: Jason was Macon's son. I had never betrayed him. The question that tormented me was, how is this possible? How could I have a black son if neither he nor I had this apparent heritage? It was a mystery that grew like a shadow inside me. Lying in bed, with Jason breathing peacefully beside me, I whispered, "One day, my son, the truth will come out. I will fight for us. I will show everyone that you were never a mistake. You are my greatest gift." And, deep within, a flame began to grow, the search for truth. Public humiliation. In the early days after the divorce, I barely left the house. I was tired, fragile, trying to learn to care for Jason alone. But there were things I couldn't avoid: grocery shopping, doctor's appointments, trips to the pharmacy. And it was on these small outings that I discovered how cruel people can be. In the grocery line, a woman I knew by sight approached. She looked at Jason, then at me, and smiled venomously. "So it's true, Claire. You really did fool poor Micon." I felt my face burn, but I replied firmly, "I didn't fool anyone. Jason is his son." She laughed loudly and walked away, muttering for others to hear. She still maintains that lie to this day. Rumors spread like wildfire. As I walked down the street, I noticed people whispering, some even pointing. It was as if I were a spectacle of public shame. It didn't matter if I told the truth, no one believed it. Macon's version was already etched in everyone's minds. I was the unfaithful woman who destroyed a family. One day, I was invited to Macon's parents' house for a final chat. Deep down, I hoped they would at least want to see their grandson. But I was naive. As soon as I arrived, holding Jason, his mother greeted me at the door with a stern look. "Don't bring that child here again. He's not part of our family." I froze. Jason shifted in my lap, as if sensing the venom in those words. I took a deep breath and said, "He's your grandson, whether you like it or not. Macon's blood runs through him." But the answer was even crueler: "The only blood I see is that of your lie." As I spoke, I noticed other relatives gathered in the room, as if it were a trial. One of the aunts stood up and said, "You should be ashamed to show up here. If you want to raise this boy, do it far away. Don't tarnish our family name any further." It was as if I were being thrown out of a courtroom, without the right to a defense. I left with a heavy heart, but also a strange sense of relief. It was painful to lose the support of an entire family, but somehow, I already knew, they would never take me back. My only real family now was Jason. The humiliation didn't stop there. At work, colleagues who previously treated me with respect began to avoid me. Conversations ended when I entered the room. Even some neighbors stopped talking to me. I became invisible, or worse, a target. In those moments, the pain was almost unbearable. But whenever I thought about giving up, I looked at Jason. He was too young to understand, but he was already my biggest motivation. If I fell, he would fall with me. And I couldn't allow that. That night, after another flood of tears, I made a silent promise: I will find out the truth, no matter what the cost. And when that day comes, no one will ever dare to humiliate you again. My son. Alone with Jason, the following days were a mix of exhaustion and learning. I had never imagined raising a baby would be so demanding. Jason cried in the early hours of the morning, needed to be nursed, changed, and rocked. And even though my body ached from the recent birth, I had no choice. I was alone. There were moments when I would look at him sleeping and feel an indescribable peace. But soon the fear would return. How would I support this child without Macon's support? How would I face an entire world that seemed determined to reject us? These questions haunted me like shadows. My mother tried to help me, but she was already old and tired. My father remained distant, rarely speaking to me. When I looked at Jason, I could see he was struggling with his own prejudices. This hurt me more than I could bear. I remember one particular morning. Jason cried non-stop, and I'd tried everything. Exhausted, I sat on the bedroom floor with him in my arms and cried along with him. Why is all this happening to us? I whispered, not expecting an answer. But at that moment, Jason calmed down and grabbed my finger with his little hand. It was like saying, "Mommy, we're together." I started to get organized. Between feedings and changing, I made plans. I decided I would return to work as soon as possible, even if it was something simple, as long as it gave me autonomy. If Maicon wanted to abandon me, I would prove I could go it alone. Still, the loneliness was cruel. There were no more messages from friends, no more visits. The phone rang only with demands or gossip disguised as concern. I quickly learned to filter out who truly cared about us. Almost no one, but somehow, this solitude strengthened me. I discovered within myself a courage I had never felt before. Every sleepless night, every tear shed, turned into resilience. I was surviving, and, deep down, beginning to truly live. Jason was growing up fast. Week by week, I saw his features becoming more defined, his skin beautiful, his curious eyes exploring the world. He was living proof that life always finds a way to blossom. Even in the midst of a storm, but there was one question that never left me: how could I, a white woman, the daughter of white parents, have given birth to a black son? It didn't make sense. It was as if there was a secret hidden within my own skin, a riddle I needed to decipher. One of those early mornings, watching Jason sleep, I promised, one day, I will understand all of this. One day, I will tell you who we really are. And when that day comes, no one will doubt us anymore. Time passed, and Jason was already a few months old. I had grown accustomed to the sleepless nights, the squinting glances, and the heavy silence of my own home. But something inside me wouldn't shut up. It was the persistent doubt, hammering at my heart. How could my son be black, if Maicon and I were white? At first, I tried to convince myself it was just distant genetics, perhaps some forgotten trait from our family's past. But that explanation never satisfied me. The more I looked at Jason, the more I sensed there was something bigger, something hidden in our history. One day, I decided to ask my mother, Margaret, directly. We were in the kitchen, rocking Jason on my lap while she made tea. I summoned the courage to say, "Mom, is there something in our family I don't know about? Any distant relatives with dark skin?" She froze. The silence that followed was more telling than any answer. My mother looked away, stirred her spoon unnecessarily in her cup, and replied quietly, "No, Claire. There's nothing like that. You're just confused." But her voice was shaking. I insisted, "But Mom, there needs to be an explanation. Jason is my son, I know that. I never cheated on Maicon. So, how is that possible?" She sighed deeply, closed her eyes for a moment, and then changed the subject, as if my questions were too inconvenient to even exist. From that day on, I realized there was a wall between us. My mother didn't want to talk. And the more she remained silent, the more my curiosity grew. I began to notice small details from the past, memories that had never made sense before. I remembered that, as a child, I'd often heard strange comments from neighbors. "That girl doesn't look anything like her parents." I always thought it was an exaggeration. Now, those memories came flooding back like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet put together. My father, in turn, became even more distant. When I brought up the subject, he would shut down completely, as if afraid that a single word could shatter our family's entire facade. His silence was even more disturbing than my mother's. I began to write down questions in a notebook. Where do I really come from? Is there something hidden in my family's past? Could it be that I'm not who I always thought I was? These questions echoed in my mind, accompanying me through each silent dawn. I didn't know it yet, but this notebook of questions would be the beginning of a long journey. A search for the truth about who I really was, and who Jason, my son, was destined to be. After my first attempt to talk to my mother, I realized she would do everything she could to avoid the subject. Whenever I mentioned Jason, our origins, or any detail about distant relatives, Margareth would quickly change the subject, as if afraid the truth might slip out. It was painful. I needed answers, but the person who could help me most hid behind a wall of silence. I began to observe her more closely. When she saw Jason in my lap, there was a strange mix in her gaze. Pride, but also fear. Love, but also discomfort. One afternoon, I decided to be blunt. "Mom, why don't you ever look Jason in the eye? What does he bring out in you?" She stood still for a few seconds, as if my words were a knife that had stabbed her. Then she simply replied, "Don't say that, Claire. I love that boy." But I knew there was something hidden there. I tried to insist, "Mom, I need to understand. You know Jason is my son and that I never cheated on my con. But if you don't help me understand how this is possible, I'll never be able to move on." She took a deep breath, turned away, and began washing the dishes without saying anything else. In that heavy silence, I felt a confirmation. There were secrets. And my mother knew them. The way she refused to speak only increased my certainty that there was a truth buried in our past. I spent sleepless nights reminiscing about little details from my childhood. I remembered having few photo albums of myself as a baby. There were plenty of photos from parties and trips, but almost none from the first few months of my life. I always thought it was normal. Now, it seemed suspicious. I once asked about my birth, and my mother responded with memorized phrases. "It was a difficult birth, but you were born healthy." Always with the same rehearsed tone, as if it were a story repeated so many times it had become automatic. But the feeling growing inside me that it wasn't the whole truth, my father, when questioned, would become even more withdrawn. He would simply get up from the table and walk away, as if my presence were a burden. This hurt me, but it also challenged me. I needed to dig deeper, even if it meant breaking up with them. There was one person who might have had the courage to speak up, my grandmother. She was already very ill, rarely getting out of bed, but she always looked at me tenderly. I saw in her eyes a desire to say something, as if she held a story that couldn't die with her. In that moment, I knew my next conversation would be with her. My grandmother held the key. And somehow, I felt like the answers I'd been searching for were about to find me, even if they destroyed me first. After each silence from my mother and my father's distancing, my distrust only grew. It was as if every day I saw more clearly that my life story was riddled with holes. I felt like someone who had lived for years in a solid house, but suddenly discovered cracks in the walls. Jason was living proof that something was hidden. I looked at him and saw beauty, strength, purity. But I also saw questions. He carried a heritage I didn't know about, and I couldn't let him grow up without answers. I needed to find out where it really came from. Childhood memories came back like ghosts. I remembered comments from neighbors, teachers, people who said, "Claire doesn't look like their daughter." At the time, I laughed, thinking it was just gossip. Now, each of those phrases weighed heavily, like a clue I'd ignored for years. I began to rummage through old photo albums. There were few pictures of me as a baby, many from trips and later parties. The lack of records of my early days was glaring. I tried to ask my mother again, but she just replied, "Not all the photos were saved, Claire. That doesn't mean anything." But to me, it meant everything. The way my father reacted hurt me deeply. One day, I tried to talk about my doubts, and he simply got up from the table, threw his napkin on his plate, and left without saying a word. It was as if my desire for truth were an affront. This reaction made me wonder, did my parents know something too shameful to admit? Could there be a secret that could shatter the image of a perfect family they'd always maintained? The more I reflected, the more certain I became that it was. As Jason grew older, I could already imagine the questions he'd ask in the future. I couldn't let my son be condemned to carry doubts about his origins. I needed to face this pain now, so he could have a freer life later. My heart told me my grandmother was the key. Whenever she saw me with Jason, she smiled tenderly, but also with a look of melancholy. It was as if she were silently telling me, "I know who you are, my girl." I gathered my courage and decided that the next time I visited her, I wouldn't leave without answers. My grandmother was sick, weakened, and I knew we might not have much time. But inside her lived the story that could change everything. That night, as I rocked Jason, I whispered, "Tomorrow, son, I'll find your great-grandmother. And maybe, just maybe, we'll finally find out the truth about ourselves." The next morning, I gathered my courage and went to my grandmother's house. She was frail and wouldn't get out of bed anymore. The room smelled of medicine and lavender, and the light filtered in softly through the curtains, illuminating her tired face. Jason was asleep on my lap when I sat beside her. She opened her eyes slowly and smiled when she saw us. A fragile smile, but full of love. "My girl, and little Jason," she murmured, her voice almost muffled. I squeezed her wrinkled hand and felt the urgent need to say everything that was stuck in my throat. "Grandma," I began, tears already in my eyes, "I need you to be honest with me. There's something in our family that I've never been told. Jason was born black, and I know he's Macon's son. I never cheated on him. So how is this possible?" My grandmother closed her eyes for a few seconds, as if gathering the strength to open the door to a secret kept for decades. When she looked back at me, tears were welling in her tired eyes. "It's time for you to know the truth, Claire. I can't leave with this burden." My heart raced. I knew I was about to hear something that would change my life forever. She took a deep breath and said, "You're not Margaretha's daughter." I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. My first reaction was to deny it. That can't be true. She's my mother, always has been. But my grandmother squeezed my hand with surprising strength and continued, "She raised her. Yes, but she didn't give birth to her. Margaret couldn't have children. Her father. He had an affair with another woman, an African woman." My breath caught. Each word my grandmother spoke felt like a bolt of lightning striking my chest. "An African woman?" I repeated, my voice almost broken. "So. Does that mean my blood is hers?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, my dear. You were born from this relationship. Your father, when he learned of the pregnancy, decided he wouldn't leave the child behind. He brought you as a baby, and Margaret, though hurt, agreed to raise you as his legitimate daughter. But she never spoke of it. For her, silence was the only way to keep the family together." I didn't know whether to cry with relief or pain. In a matter of minutes, I discovered that my entire life had been built on a lie. My mother wasn't my mother. My father had betrayed me. And my real mother, who was she? Where was she? Why had they allowed her to be erased from my story? I looked at Jason, sleeping peacefully in my lap. For the first time, I understood. My son wasn't a mistake. He was the answer. The link that connected me to my true origins, to the blood that ran through my veins and that no one could ever erase. My grandmother's words wouldn't leave my head. I spent days in silence, trying to assimilate what I had discovered. I wasn't Margaretha's daughter. I wasn't the product of the marriage I'd always imagined to be solid. I was the product of a secret, a betrayal, a story buried in the past. I returned to visit my grandmother, still in her bed, because I needed to hear more. When I entered, she smiled slightly, as if she had been waiting for me to return. I sat down next to her and asked, "Grandma, who was this woman? Who was my real mother?" She took a deep breath, fighting the weakness, and replied, "Your father never spoke much of her. She was a strong woman, with dark skin and deep eyes. He met her on a business trip. It was a forbidden, hidden romance. But from her, you were born, my heart sank. And why did he bring me? Why didn't he leave me with her? My grandmother closed her eyes, a tear rolling down her face. Because he was afraid. Afraid of scandal, afraid of social rejection, afraid of losing what he had built with Margareth. He knew Margareth couldn't get pregnant, so he used this tragedy as an excuse to take you in. He believed he was doing the best thing. I felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Best for whom? Certainly not for my real mother, who had her daughter ripped from her arms. And not for me, who grew up believing a lie. My grandmother's silence hurt. But at the same time, I understood, she was trying to give me a piece of truth before she left. My real mother. She wanted to raise me? I asked, my voice breaking. The answer was a whisper, yes, Claire. She cried a lot when your father took her. But he promised you would have a better life in America. We never heard from her again. My chest burned. The image of that unknown woman, weeping for the daughter taken from her, haunted me like a ghost. I, who had so often felt out of place as a child, now understood why. My roots were far away, in a land I'd never known. I looked at Jason, and a wave of understanding washed over me. He wasn't some inexplicable genetic error. He was a reflection of my true heritage. Of the woman who gave birth to me and who could never raise me. Jason was a living reminder that blood speaks, even when they try to silence it. Anger toward my father grew. He had not only betrayed Margareth, but also robbed a mother of her daughter's chance to be with her. And Margareth, by accepting this lie, had also condoned this silence. I loved them, but I could no longer see them the same way. That night I wrote in my notebook, who am I, anyway? Where is my real mother? Is she still alive? Did she ever look for me? I need to know. For my son. For my future. For my identity. It was the beginning of a quest that I knew would change everything. In the days following my grandmother's revelation, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. Everything I believed about myself seemed to crumble. I was not only Claire, the abandoned wife, the humiliated mother, but also Claire, the child of a secret, the child of a carefully crafted lie. I spent hours staring in the mirror, searching my features for something that connected me to this unknown woman. The shape of my eyes, the curve of my lips, even the tone of my skin, everything seemed to suddenly take on new meaning. It was as if I were looking at a reflection I had never understood before. Anger toward my father began to grow like an uncontrollable flame. He not only deceived Margareth, but he also robbed me of the chance to grow up knowing my true roots. He deprived me of my mother, and with it, of an essential part of my identity. And Margareth? My foster mother. My mother who cradled me, cared for me, and at the same time maintained a sham. I loved her deeply, but now that love was mixed with pain and resentment. How could she accept this? How could she remain silent in the face of such injustice? I could no longer look at Jason without feeling a pang of guilt. My son wasn't a source of shame, he was the naked truth no one wanted to see. And because of that, he was rejected by his own father and the family that should have welcomed him. He was innocent, but he already carried the weight of secrets that predated his birth. I remember one night when Jason was crying uncontrollably, and I held him tight, whispering, "You're not to blame, my love. You're perfect. If anyone was wrong, it wasn't us." As I said that, I realized I needed to believe those words myself, yet with every hospital visit, every look from my grandmother, I felt time slipping through my fingers. She was the only one who could give me clues about the woman who gave birth to me, and I knew her days were numbered. The fear of losing this chance consumed me. Meanwhile, the memory of the day Maikon abandoned me came back like a recurring ghost. His look of contempt, his cruel words, the way he closed the door, leaving me alone with Jason in his arms. He believed I had betrayed him, when in reality, I myself had been deceived for a lifetime. It was a cruel irony. He accused me of betrayal, but my entire existence was the result of my father's betrayal. I was trapped in a cycle of inherited pain, and I desperately needed to break that chain. I wrote once again in my notebook, "I'm not just a victim. I won't just be an echo of the past. I need to find my mother. I need to find the truth. Because only then will I be able to forgive myself and give Jason the future he deserves. The hospital room was heavy with silence, interrupted only by the sound of machines and my grandmother's frail breathing. I held her hand, feeling cold and fragile like never before. I knew time was running out, and my heart raced with fear that I wouldn't hear the answers I so desperately needed from her. "Grandma," I whispered, fighting back tears, "I need to know who my real mother was. Where is she?" My voice trembled, and my soul seemed to beg more than my mouth. She turned her face slowly to me, her eyes watering with memories that weighed more heavily than any physical pain. "Claire. Your mother. She was a woman of courage, beauty, and pure soul. It wasn't your fault she was taken from her." I felt a lump tighten in my throat. My grandmother took a deep breath, as if each word had been stolen by time. "Your father was selfish. He met her when he traveled to Africa for work. He got involved with her. And when he found out about the pregnancy, he was afraid of scandal. He brought you here secretly, as a baby." "And Margareth?" I asked, my voice almost choked. Why did she accept this? Why did she raise me knowing I wasn't her daughter? Margareth couldn't have children. She loved her father too much to leave him. And at the same time, she loved a child too much to reject one. But she never stopped carrying the pain of betrayal. Silence was the price she paid to keep her family together. Those words were like knives. I loved Margareth, but now I understood her distance at times, her coldness at others. She loved me, but she also reminded me of the wound that never healed in her marriage, and my biological mother. I insisted, crying. "Is she alive? What happened to her?" Grandma closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "She never stopped looking for you. She sent letters, which your father hid. She cried for you every day." My heart shattered. I had been loved, desired, but ripped from the hands that wanted me most. The injustice weighed so heavily I could barely breathe. "Grandma, tell me, what was her name?" I asked desperately, with a thin voice. Almost like a final breath, she said, "Amara, your mother's name is Amara." Immediately afterward, her eyes slowly closed, and I felt her life slip through my fingers. I cried out her name in tears, hugging her limp hand. In that instant, I knew, my destiny was to find Amara, no matter what. After my grandmother's death, I spent days in silence, barely able to stand. Jason was the only reason I stood up. As I rocked my son, his name echoed in my mind over and over, Amara. My real mother. The woman who gave me life and who, until that moment, I believed had never existed. I began searching for traces. I opened old boxes in my parents' attic, rummaging through folders, letters, and photo albums. It was among the yellowed papers that I found what would change everything: an envelope hidden behind a book, stamped with an African country. Inside was a letter. The words were written in shaky Portuguese, but charged with emotion. "My daughter Claire, I have never stopped thinking about you. Your laughter still lives in my dreams. I hope one day I can look into your eyes and tell you I have always loved you." My heart nearly leaped into my throat. It was her. It was Amara. Tears fell onto the paper, blurring some of the words, but it didn't matter. Here was proof that my mother loved me, that she had never abandoned me. The lie that had enveloped me my entire life was beginning to unravel in the face of the truth. I showed Margareth the letter. She remained silent, staring at the paper as if it were a ghost. "Your father didn't want you to know," she said softly. "He was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of losing everything, and you?" I asked, my chest aching. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let me grow up without knowing who I was?" Margareth lowered her eyes and replied, "Because, deep down, I was afraid that if I found out the truth, you would reject me. I had already lost my husband, I didn't want to lose you too." I cried again, but not just from pain. There was compassion in my heart. Margareth wasn't innocent, but she wasn't a villain either. She, too, had been a prisoner of my father's lie. Deep down, her silence stemmed from the confused fear and love she felt for me. I decided I needed to go further. I searched for my father's travel records, tracked down old contacts, even visited notary offices in search of documents. Each clue seemed to lead me deeper into a labyrinth, but also closer to Amara. During one of my searches, I found an old black and white photograph. In it, a man I recognized as my father stood next to a young black woman with a sweet gaze and a serene smile. On the back, scrawled by hand, was simply written, Amara, 1987. My heart sank like never before. That face. Somehow, it was familiar. It was like looking at Jason from the future, as if his blood had crossed generations to find itself in me. In that moment, I swore to myself, I would find Amara. I would find my mother, no matter the cost. It was in a silent dawn that the realization truly sank in. Jason cried in my arms, and as I cradled his fragile little body, I realized how much I still saw him as a reflection of pain. As if he were a constant reminder of his father's rejection, the humiliation I'd suffered, the lie about my origins. Suddenly, my heart sank. Jason wasn't the embodiment of my shame, but rather my truth. He carried within him the legacy of a history that had been stolen from me. He was, in fact, the piece of Amara that had finally returned to me. I began to see him with different eyes. His small smile, his little fingers squeezing mine, the curious look that shone even so early in life. Jason was innocent. Jason was pure. And I, as a mother, had a mission to prevent him from growing up feeling the weight of prejudice and rejection that had already marked our path. I remembered my grandmother's words on her deathbed, she never stopped looking for you. Amara had fought for me. And now it was my turn to fight for Jason. I couldn't repeat history, couldn't let him grow up without knowing how much he was loved, without feeling pride in what he represented. In the days that followed, I began to go out with him without fear of other people's stares. Before, every whisper, was like a knife to me. Now, when they looked at me askance, I would lift my head and hug Jason to my chest. As if to say, you can judge, but he is my son. He is my pride. It was difficult. The small town talked. The neighbors whispered. Some people had the courage to ask sarcastically, are you sure who the father is? And each time I heard that, I took a deep breath and answered firmly, yes. The father is my Khan. But I'm the one raising him. This phrase became a mantra within me. It didn't matter who had turned their backs on me, who had judged me. I was there, steadfast, choosing to be a mother every day. And that choice was greater than any judgment. As Jason grew older, I began to see in him traces of what connected me to my lost origins. His smile reminded me of the woman in the photograph. Amara. His curious demeanor seemed to scream that there was something about him that came from far away, from deep roots, from a culture I hadn't yet discovered but needed to discover. It was then that, for the first time, I understood that Jason wasn't just revealing a truth about my past. He was also guiding me toward my future. He was the bridge between who I thought I was and who I really was. That night, before going to sleep, I wrote one more sentence in my notebook: accepting Jason is accepting myself. He's not proof of my pain. He's proof of my new beginning. And I fell asleep with a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Pain had shaped me for so long that I'd almost forgotten it was possible to transform it into something greater. But it was when I saw Jason as my link to truth that I understood. I no longer needed to carry the weight of shame. I could carry the banner of strength. I began to walk the streets differently. She was no longer the woman abandoned by her husband. She was no longer the daughter of a lie. I was Claire, Jason's mother, heir to a stolen story, and yet, a survivor. I went back to school. I enrolled in a night class while working during the day. Jason stayed with a trusted neighbor, and every hour we spent apart fueled my purpose. I didn't just want to survive, I wanted to build something for him. At first, the effort seemed impossible. There were nights when I cried from exhaustion, with my books open and Jason sleeping beside me. But then I remembered my grandmother's look, the smile I imagined on Amara, and the innocence on my son's face. And I started again, even with my eyes swollen with sleep. Little by little, I gained respect. Not from everyone, of course. Many still whispered, many still judged me. But there were those who began to admire the courage of a mother who, alone, held her head high and carried on. I remember one day I ran into my con on the street. He was dejected, with a lost look in his eyes, and he tried to speak to me. I simply picked Jason up and walked past him. For the first time, I felt no anger, no desire for revenge. Just indifference. And I realized, this was victory. My pride in myself began to grow. I didn't need anyone's validation. My life wasn't defined by Macon's abandonment, nor my father's lies, nor Margaretha's silence. My life was defined by the choices I was making now. I began telling Jason short stories about courage, roots, and dignity. He was still too young to understand, but I knew those words, spoken in the silence of the night, would plant seeds in his soul. It was during this period that I also began to dream again. Dreaming of the possibility of finding Amara, dreaming of telling her that her daughter survived. That her grandson existed, that her lineage had not been erased. I wrote in my notebook, in firm letters, without tears this time, I am not a product of betrayal. I am the fruit of resistance. From pain, I transformed my life into strength. And from strength, I will give birth to my son's future. The dawn that day felt different. The sun flooded my room with a soft light, as if inviting me to see life through new eyes. Jason played in his crib, laughing to himself, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift. I picked him up and, looking into his eyes, said, "My son, you are my truth. You are proof that no lie can erase who we truly are." He smiled, and in that smile I found the strength of 1,000 battles won. As the months passed, I reorganized my life. I moved house, sought new job opportunities, and learned not to depend on anyone's approval. Each step was a new beginning, each achievement a piece of the dignity that had been denied me. The past still hurt, but it no longer paralyzed me. Now it served as fuel. My father's betrayal, Margaretha's silence, Macon's abandonment, all of it had wounded me, but it had also shaped me. I wasn't a victim. I was a survivor. I decided Jason would grow up knowing the whole truth. I didn't want to burden him with the burden of secrets and silences. He would know his grandmother Amara, her story, her roots. Not as a wound, but as a source of pride. I wrote a letter addressed to Amara. In the lines, I told her who I was, about Jason, and about the promise I made. I want to find you. I want to look into your eyes and tell you that your daughter endured. I want you to meet the grandson who carries your strength within him. As I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, I felt something new, hope. For the first time, it wasn't just a distant dream. It was a decision. I would pursue it, no matter how long it took or how many obstacles I encountered. That same day, I took Jason for a walk in the park. I sat on the grass, watching him crawl and smile at the world. And I realized there was nothing more beautiful than watching him grow free, without the chains of shame that had imprisoned me for so many years. I looked up at the sky and silently spoke to my grandmother. "Thank you for giving me the truth before you left. I promise I won't stop until I find Amara. I promise Jason will grow up knowing who he is. And that he will be proud of every part of his story." In that moment, I understood that this wasn't the end, but the beginning. A new beginning. Of a life built on truth, courage, and love. I, Claire May, daughter of Amara, Jason's mother, was no longer a prisoner of the lies of the past. I was the master of my own destiny.